So when you open a tube of acrylic paint, you get color. But color is only one of the things in there. There are really three ingredients doing the work in every tube of acrylic: pigment, binder, and the vehicle. Let's break it down. First, pigment. So this is the color. This is the solid, finely ground powder, and it's what your eye actually sees when you're looking at a painting. So here's the key thing. Pigment is suspended in paint and it's not dissolved. So the particles are floating around in there, they're evenly spread out, and that's different from a dye, which dissolves completely in the product. Pigments are generally much more stable and longer lasting than dyes, which is exactly why artists use pigments. Pigments come in two broader families. So there's inorganic pigments. They're mineral based. They might be things like iron oxide earths, cadmiums, cobalt, and titanium white. Then you have organic pigments, and they're carbon based, and they tend to be really intense, vivid colors like the phthalos, the quinacridones, and the pyrroles. If you look closely at a tube, you'll see a code like PB, PR, PBR, or PY. That stands for the pigment blue, pigment red, pigment brown, and pigment yellow. It tells you the exact pigment inside of each paint, and we'll do a whole video on those later. Pigment is what controls the color, sure, but it also controls how opaque or transparent the paint is, and how strong it is when you mix it, and how light fast it is. Real pigment, and a lot of it, is the single biggest reason a professional paint costs more than a cheap one. So we'll come back to that later. This is also where TriArt does things a little bit differently. We mill our pigments to an exceptionally fine grind, finer than most, and when the pigment is ground that finely, that's what gives you the extra saturation, chroma, and depth in color. So the same pigment, ground finer, just reads richer on the canvas. Our second ingredient, so this is the binder. This is the acrylic. If pigment is the color, the binder is the glue. So the binder is what holds all the pigment particles together and sticks them to your surface. And it starts as tiny little particles of acrylic resin that are dispersed in water. So as the paint dries, those particles lock together and they form a continuous flexible film with the pigment trapped inside of it. The binder is actually what defines the type of paint. So the same red pigment, it can go into an oil paint, it can go into a watercolor or an acrylic. What makes it acrylic is the acrylic binder. So oil paint uses different kinds of drying oils. Watercolor uses gum arabic. We're using acrylic polymer. So it's the same color, completely different paint. A good binder gives you a film that's flexible, durable, and water resistant once it's cured. So it shouldn't crack, it shouldn't yellow over time, and that's a big deal for anything that you want to last. So a cheap binder is typically where you start to notice these problems develop over the years, long after you've finished your painting. So this is another place where our formulation is a little bit different. Our base is a custom-made high solids acrylic resin, which basically means there's more actual resin and less water in the product to begin with. And that matters for two reasons. You're getting more paint and less water for your money, and a high solids resin can carry a much higher pigment load without compromising the paint. So that finely milled pigment we had just talked about has to live somewhere, right? So that resin forms its base. That's where it lives. Third, the vehicle. This is the liquid that carries everything and makes the paint basically spreadable and paintable. So in acrylics, the main player here is water. So the vehicle is the reason that you can brush, pour, or knife the paint around instead of fighting a dry lump of pigment and resin. Because it's water-based, it's also why acrylics are low odor and clean up with plain water instead of solvents. So it's easy to clean, low odor, it's great stuff. Here's what's happening when acrylic dries. The water evaporates, and as it leaves, those acrylic binder particles I mentioned before move closer together and fuse into one solid film. And that process is permanent, so once it's dry, it won't dissolve back into water. That's why a dried acrylic layer stays put when you paint over it, and it's a totally different drying process from oils. Oils naturally oxidize over time, so they react with the air and they harden. So that's the core three. You have pigment, that gives you the color. You have the binder, that's what holds it onto the canvas. And then you have the vehicle, and that's what lets you work. If you only put pigment, acrylic binder, and water in a container, it would just be a disaster. It would separate, you would have maybe a foamy consistency, it would be a big mess. You might even get mold growing into it. It's that horrible. So every real paint also contains small amounts of additives. These are things that keep the pigment evenly dispersed. It controls the viscosity, so it can make it thinner or thicker. And it allows the paint to hold a brushstroke like you'd expect. It'll stop it from foaming, it'll buffer the pH, it'll preserve it so it lasts in the tube. Now, done right, these additives are minimal and they're there to make the paint perform. Done cheaply, the additives can turn into fillers. They could be cheap bulking agents and pad out the tube and water down the pigment. And that's how you get a paint that looks fine in the store and then goes on weak and chalky and disappointing, or even just doesn't mix colors correctly. A professional quality paint is actually the hardest kind of acrylic to make. It has the fewest ingredients, but in the highest concentration, so there's nowhere to hide. There's no fillers propping it up. So when you're comparing paints, you're really comparing three things: how much real pigment is in there, the quality of the binder, and whether the rest of the tube is honest formulation or just filler. That's the anatomy of acrylic paint. You got pigment, binder, vehicle, and the additives that hold it all together. I hope you find this video helpful. Next, we're going to be tackling viscosity. So what does that mean? We have high viscosity colors, we have low viscosity colors. So subscribe so you don't miss any of that. And thanks for watching.